Hello, everyone. I'm going to apologise in advance because my cat is being a complete twat. Um, so, what I want to do with this video is basically go through a little bit more of AO1, which I was talking about in a video I did quite recently about just the basics of the AOs. So, AO1, as I said in that video, is basically knowledge, is you telling me something, but you need to know when AQA is asking you to tell them something. And so what I've got up here is very easy. Again, if you wanted to find this, just type in AQA command words. Takes you to the first one. Click on that, takes you through to the screen. It's basically a list of words that they can get you to do. So some of these words you see very, very often: identify, describe, evaluate, discuss. You see that. Stop that. You see it quite often, but some of the words you don't really see that much. So, for example, critically, you don't really see that much, but you could do. So the point I'm making here is it's worth familiarizing yourself with these because you need to know what to do when you are asked. So, for example, discuss, even one that comes up quite often: discuss, discuss, discuss. Loads of people don't. Discuss basically means describe and evaluate. In fact, I can kind of say this. So set out both sides of an argument for and against and come to a conclusion. There should be some balance. So basically discusses, there is a description element to it, but discussers mainly give both sides of the argument, which is, if you're going to university, is what you have to do constantly. So evaluate, you could hit strength, strength, strength. You can do that. It's not very good, but you can do that. But discuss, you really have to weigh up both the pros and cons of the fors and against and stuff like that. So if we're looking at some of these words, describe, no matter what the question says, if it's describe anything, you have to give AO1. AO1's quite easy, but I mean, you're looking at things like, it's not actually on here, but identify. I don't know why it's not on here, but identify will be one. State, name, outline, all of these things. Summarize, provide a brief account of relevant information. So descriptions tend to be more detailed than outlines, for example. So the point I'm saying here is you need to familiarize yourself with these terms. I just want to give you a reminder of how important AO1 is. AO1 is not so much important in terms of how much you will be asked. It's only potentially less than a third of your grade. But why is AO1 so important? Because you cannot do AO2 and AO3 without AO1. You cannot analyze, you cannot apply, you cannot evaluate what you don't know. So your knowledge is super important, right? Super, super, super important. I just want to point down, because I did realize after the video I did last time, I didn't mention these couple of bits down the bottom. So at least 10% of your grade will come from mathematical skills, equivalent to GCSE or above. So you're looking at things like, calculating the mean is the easiest thing you're going to have to do, to all the way doing statistical tests and justifying why you would pick a chi-squared over a Mann-Whitney or whatever. So 10% of your course is that, but have a look at how much time you need to know research methods, right? If you don't get research methods, if you don't know research methods, if you don't know, understand, apply, or be able to evaluate research methods, you lose 30% of your grade straight off the bat, which pretty much almost guarantees you're not going to get the grade that you actually need. So you have to be good at research methods. So the only other thing I would say about AO1 is you need to know specialist terminology for every single bullet point. You need to know really good specialist terminology, i.e. things that aren't necessarily in your bullet point, but can only be used in that spec, for example. So if I were to go to a random one that the year twos may have done recently, if I go all the way down to the bottom and go to schizophrenia, if I were to go to, let's say, biological explanations, right? So you've got genetics, dopamine hypothesis, neural correlates. What terms can you only use in that bullet point? Hyperdopaminergia, hypodopaminergia, candidate genes, C4 gene, the SERT gene, for example, the mesolimbic system, the mesocortical system. So all of these things You really have to be able to use those terms. And one thing that frustrates the bejesus out of me is when GCSE teachers tell their students that they should treat the examiner like an idiot, and that you should explain things in the most basic way. I am not a fan of that whatsoever. Some teachers maybe. I don't think that's a very good approach at all, because you're supposed to show that you are experts. Well, you're supposed to show that you are, really technical writers. You're going to need to use you're going to need to use, show, utilize the really, really good terms that hardly anybody else is going to go for, makes you stand out, and you're going to have to actually know those terms. So what I would go through is, and this is good practice, if you really want to do well, go through every bullet point, and do this over a long period of time. I'm not getting you to do this over a weekend, but go through each bullet point. And so if we go back to the beginning where you might be a bit familiar, if you look at this bullet point here and say, right, okay, let's just pretend you got a 6 marker on explanations for conformity, informational social influence, and normative social influence, and you were to describe both of those for 6 marks. What terms would you come up with? So approval. So people conform for approval. People conform because they deem some people deem their peers to be intellectually superior. So again, that's a good term that you could use, and that's all to do with informational social influence, for example. So the key thing about AO1 is you have to know the terms. You have to know the terms. Something's going to make you stand out. But apart from that, you have to actually understand it. So there are parts of the spec here. There are parts of the spec that people find a bit more difficult than others, for example. So if I were to go to the role of social influence processes and social change, people really sometimes don't understand this, even though they know all the theories, but they then can't use the theories particularly well. You have to know this. It's only a third. Now, I kind of went through like specialist terms. So this is a model answer. I think I got it from a student and then I typed it up about the working memory model, which we may or may not have done by this point. But what it would be worth looking through is looking through this now, pause the video, and go through what terms can only be used in that bullet point. So you're looking at things like the central executive would be a good thing, right? Attentional resources, 2 slave systems, attention, visuospatial sketchpad, phonological loop, auditory information, even that 1.5 seconds. Where else in the spec are you going to talk about 1.5 seconds? So again, that's just a little bit of deeper, more extensive knowledge. It's not surf level knowledge. But here's the problem, and I'm kind of rabbiting on a little bit here. But for a question like this, people get way too hung up in the AO1. People get really excited that they know the AO1. They're like, I know it. So I'll just talk about it for like 15 minutes out of the 20 minutes, and then you've got hardly any. You have to go with where the marks are. In this question, the marks are really not with description. They are with the more elaborated evaluations. So yes, knowledge is important. Yes, you need it for AO2. Yes, you need it for AO3. But don't try to show off your knowledge too much at the expense of where the marks actually are, because the examiner is never going to give you marks if you rabbit on about AO1. The last thing I just wanted to mention, this is going on a bit longer than I intended. This may be different to if this goes out to other teachers, but this other classes. But this may be different to what your teachers say. But what I say to my students, and this is directed at my students, flashcards should only contain AO1. They should only contain AO1. If you write your AO1 on one side of flashcard, then AO3 on the other side of the flashcard, what you're essentially doing is you're doubling how much you're trying to remember. And anyone who ever tries to double the amount they remember, or maybe even triple the amount they remember, is never going to do as well as someone who can just remember their AO1, but think of their AO3s off the top of your head. And I'm not going to go through AO3s now, because that's going to be for another video. But your flashcard should have And this is what I say to my students. Again, this may be different. So again, talk to your teacher beforehand. I don't want to step on their toes. But if we have a look at, let's go back to one you might know a bit more. If we go back to, let's say, psychopathology, what I say to my students is you should have one flashcard per bullet point. One flashcard for a bullet point. That is front and back, by the way. So two sides, one flashcard, two sides, basically. So for this one here, the behavioral approach to explaining and treating phobia. So technically, that's that's a terrible example, because that's technically two. Let's go with let's go with this one just here. Explanation of attachment, learning theory. Yeah, I've picked another terrible one. Why have I picked another terrible? You know what? I'm just going to go to an easy one. Should have really thought about this before, to be honest. Multi-store model. In this case, you should one flashcard per bullet point. You should realistically have everything about your AO1 for multi-store model on two sides. So, for example, you may draw the multi-store model one side, and on the other side, you may outline the coding, the capacity, the durations for all of the stages, maybe a piece of research. What I do say to students is if there is a named piece of research, then you create another flashcard detailing the aims, procedures, findings, conclusions, samples, everything to do with that piece of research. So, for example, Zimbardo, this bullet point would have two. You'd have what is actually meant, what is the theory of conformity to social roles. There's really not a lot to that, to be honest. And then on a separate flashcard, you'd have Zimbardo's actual research. And maybe then you put the evaluations, but probably not. So that is AO1, essentially. I probably did miss something. But why do I use that system? Let me try and justify that. When it comes to 30 days before the exams, I tell my students to then go mad on revision. And revision is basically trying to get that information in your head. So it's read, cover, test, read, cover, test, read, cover, test, at least 3 times a day through your revision materials. If you write the textbook out again, and you're too scared to break things down for your flashcards, if you write all the AO1 from this textbook out, you are not going to be able to read it 3 times a day, and thus you're not going to go over it enough. So your flashcards, i.e. making a flashcard per bullet point, basically is a standardized system that breaks the information down to the most important things, and the rest of the information can just be held in your workbooks, which are kind of revision materials alongside your flashcards. So that is essentially why I get my students to do it that way. That is pretty much it for AO1. There's really not a lot to it, but the main takeaway I want you to take away from this is for every one of these bullet points, you need to know specialist terminology, not the surface level crap that everybody knows, but specialist terminologies that can only be used in that bullet point. So off the top of my head, for example, a term that you might want to use for the authoritarian personality is rigid parenting styles. Off the top of my head, where else are you going to use that in the spec? Probably not many places. So if I say rigid parenting styles, the examiner immediately knows that actually I do know the authoritarian personality on a bit more of a deeper level than the person who goes, is when you obey because of your personality, isn't it? So specialist terms, you really need to know them. Right. Any question, feel free to give me a shout, but that is it for AO1. Not a lot to it.